The mansion stood like a sleeping giant at the edge of the city, its white marble pillars gleaming faintly in the moonlight, a silent testament to the wealth and power of the family that owned it. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of roses brought in fresh from the gardens each morning. It was here that Grace, a black woman in her early 40s, walked quietly down the long corridor that led to the nursery. She had been the nanny for the Whitmore family for almost 6 years now, employed after the birth of their only daughter, Arabella. In that time, she had raised the girl almost as her own, watching her first steps, hearing her first words, soothing her tears in the night when her mother was too busy hosting galas or traveling for charity events. Grace had learned to be both gentle and firm, balancing the delicate role of caregiver in a house where appearances meant everything. That evening, the house was unusually silent. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore had left for yet another high-profile dinner in the city, their chauffeurs waiting outside, their presence already drifting away like fading perfume. Grace, as always, had kissed little Arabella goodnight, tucked her into bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit, and turned off the lights. But something gnawed at her instincts. A subtle heaviness lingered in the child's room, as if silence itself was hiding something it didn't want her to see. Grace had learned long ago never to ignore that voice in her heart, the one that whispered when danger or sorrow hovered unseen. Hours later, when the clock struck midnight, she returned to check on the girl. What she found made her heart nearly stop. Arabella lay curled up in her bed, her face pale even in the dim glow of the nightlight, her small hands clutching her rabbit, so tightly the fabric seemed ready to tear. But it wasn't the tight fists or pale face that froze Grace in place. It was the sight of blood on the child's pajamas, dark stains smeared across the white cotton, soaking through at the chest. For a brief, horrible moment, Grace couldn't breathe. She rushed to the bedside, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Arabella. Baby, what happened?" The little girl stirred, eyes fluttering open with fear more than sleepiness. Tears welled up instantly, and she whimpered, "Please don't tell Mommy." Grace's heart pounded as she carefully pulled the blankets back, trying to assess where the blood was coming from. Panic filled her as she imagined injuries, wounds, something terrible she hadn't noticed before. But as she examined the girl gently, she realized with confusion that there were no cuts, no bruises, nothing that could explain the blood. The pajamas were stained, but the girl's skin underneath was untouched. Grace's mind raced. Was it a nosebleed? Had Arabella coughed something up? But even then, the pattern of the stains didn't make sense. And then, as her trembling hands lifted the child closer, she noticed the way Arabella flinched. Not from pain, but from fear. It was then Grace understood the blood might not be hers. "Where did this come from, baby?" she asked softly, trying not to let the fear in her voice show. Arabella shook her head violently, burying her face in Grace's shoulder. "I can't say," she whispered. "They said they'd hurt you if I tell." Grace froze, her arms tightening protectively around the little girl. A chill ran through her veins at the word they. Who were they? And what could an innocent child possibly know that would make someone threaten her into silence? That night became the beginning of a truth far darker than Grace had ever imagined. The Whitmore family was a name spoken with reverence in newspapers. A dynasty of wealth built on real estate, global investments, and charity foundations. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of perfection, generous, elegant, untouchable. But behind the gilded walls, something sinister lurked. Something a small child had seen but couldn't speak of. And Grace, with her unyielding love, found herself the only shield standing between the girl and the shadows that threatened her. She cleaned Arabella up gently, changed her into fresh pajamas, and held her until she fell asleep again. But Grace herself could not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair by the bed, her mind spiraling. She thought of her own childhood, of the nights she had held her little sister through storms when their mother worked double shifts. She thought of the promises she had made to God when she first came to this country, that she would protect the vulnerable, that she would never turn her back on a child in need. And now here was a child, in a palace of marble and gold, terrified and bleeding from a truth she was too afraid to speak. When morning came, Grace faced a new challenge. The Whitmores returned just before dawn, their driver carrying in bags from the evening's gala. Mrs. Whitmore breezed into the nursery, her diamond earrings still sparkling, her perfume filling the room. She kissed her daughter on the forehead absently, not even noticing the traces of distress on her face. Was she good? She asked Grace casually. Grace nodded, though her throat felt tight. How could she tell this woman, this mother, that her child had gone to bed covered in blood? Yet something in Mrs. Whitmore's sharp, distant eyes warned her. This was not a woman who would want the truth. This was a woman who valued image above all else. Grace stayed silent, but her resolve grew stronger. If Arabella couldn't speak, then she would find a way to uncover the truth herself. What she didn't know yet was how dangerous that journey would be. The next few days passed with an unsettling rhythm. Grace kept close to Arabella, watching her carefully for signs of distress, asking quiet questions when they were alone. The girl avoided her gaze most of the time, playing with her rabbit or sitting silently by the window. She was only 7, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that no child should carry. Sometimes, she would startle at small sounds, a door closing too loudly, the creak of footsteps in the hallway, and each time she would clutch Grace's arm as if seeking shelter from an invisible storm. Grace tried to press gently. "Sweetheart, I can't help you if I don't know what's wrong," she whispered one afternoon as she brushed the child's golden hair. Arabella's lips trembled. "If I tell, they'll hurt you too, and you're all I have." The words tore into Grace's heart like glass. She swallowed hard and kissed the girl's head. "Nothing in this world is going to take me from you. Not now, not ever." But deep inside, she feared what forces were at play. Forces powerful enough to silence even the heiress of one of the richest families in the country. It wasn't until the third night that Grace began piecing fragments together. She had been walking past the grand library when she heard voices behind the heavy oak doors. Mr. Whitmore's low, commanding tone, and another man's voice, harsher, laced with anger. She didn't dare press her ear to the door, but the words that floated out froze her blood. Why, the girl saw too much. There was a pause, then Mr. Whitmore said, "She's a child. No one will believe her." The other man's reply was a groan. "Children talk, and if she talks, everything falls apart." Grace hurried away before she could hear more, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. That night, as she tucked Arabella into bed, she noticed again how the girl's hands shook as she clung to her rabbit. Grace knelt beside her. "Baby, was there someone in your room the night your pajamas got bloody?" Arabella's eyes widened with terror. She looked around, as if afraid the walls themselves were listening. "They thought I was asleep," she whispered. "I wasn't. I saw Mr. Dalton. He had something red on his hands. He put it on me so I'd be scared." Grace's chest tightened. Mr. Dalton was the Whitmores' trusted advisor, a man always in their home, managing affairs, whispering secrets in the corners of hallways. Grace felt the room closing in around her. Someone had deliberately put blood on a child's pajamas to terrify her into silence. But silence about what? What had Arabella seen? And why was a man like Dalton, wealthy, powerful, tied to the family, so desperate to frighten a little girl? The days became a quiet war within the mansion. Grace smiled and carried on with her duties, but inside she was raging. Every time Dalton walked into the room with his tailored suit and cold smile, she felt her stomach churn. Arabella clung to her side more than ever, refusing to be left alone when Dalton was near. Grace knew she had to act, but the question gnawed at her: who could she trust? Going to the police seemed impossible. The Whitmores' influence stretched over the city like an iron net. She had seen stories buried in newspapers, scandals erased before they reached daylight. If she spoke, would anyone even believe a nanny's word against a dynasty? One evening, when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the nursery, Arabella spoke words that shook Grace to her core. She was coloring at her little table when she stopped suddenly, her crayon frozen mid-stroke. "He hurt someone," she said in a small voice, almost to herself. Grace set down the laundry she was folding and crouched beside her. "Who, baby?" Arabella's eyes filled with tears. I think it was one of the drivers. I saw him in the garden that night. He fell down and didn't move. Dalton was there. And then there was blood." Grace felt a rush of nausea. The truth was darker than she feared. Arabella hadn't just seen something minor. She had witnessed violence, maybe even murder. And Dalton, in his cruelty, had used the child as part of the cover-up, smearing her pajamas with blood to scare her into silence. The weight of it threatened to crush Grace. But looking at Arabella's trembling little body, She knew she had no choice. She had to protect her, no matter the cost. From that moment on, Grace lived in two worlds. In one, she was the dutiful nanny, singing lullabies, cooking simple meals, and walking Arabella through the garden. In the other, she became a quiet investigator, keeping her ears open, watching movements, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations. She learned that a driver named Manuel had recently left the family's employment, though no one would say where he went. She heard staff whispering about screams in the garden one night, quickly silenced, and she noticed how Dalton's eyes lingered on Arabella with a possessive coldness that made her skin crawl. One night, as storms raged outside and thunder rolled over the mansion, Grace made a decision. She packed a small bag for Arabella, filled it with essentials, and hid it under the bed. If things got worse, she would take the girl and run. She didn't care where. They would find shelter in a church basement, in a stranger's attic, anywhere safer than here. But fate has a way of forcing choices sooner than expected. It was past midnight when Grace heard footsteps in the hallway outside the nursery. Too heavy to be Mrs. Whitmore's, too late for a maid. She slipped out quietly, her heart in her throat, and saw Dalton standing at the door, his hand on the knob. When he saw her, his expression twisted into something both polite and threatening. "Late night, Grace," he said smoothly. Grace forced a calm she didn't feel. "She just checking on the child. She's restless with the storm." Dalton's eyes flicked toward the door, then back at her. "Be sure she sleeps soundly. Children have such wild imaginations." His smile was thin, his words dripping with menace. Grace held his gaze, refusing to look away until he finally turned and walked down the hall. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair again, watching over Arabella like a sentry, her mind whirling with prayers and plans. She thought of her mother back home, who used to say, "God puts us where we're needed most, even if we don't understand why." Grace had come here for a job, to send money back to her family, to build a better life. But now she knew this was more than employment. This was her calling, to protect a child who had no one else willing to fight for her. And so, with trembling hands but a fierce spirit, Grace began preparing for the day when she would bring the truth into the light, no matter how powerful the shadows she had to face. The storm outside subsided by morning, but inside the mansion the air grew heavier with every passing day. Grace could feel eyes on her wherever she went. Dalton's presence loomed like a shadow, his polite words laced with unspoken threats, his footsteps echoing in places they didn't belong. She kept Arabella close, never letting her out of sight, inventing excuses to walk her to school or to keep her indoors when Dalton prowled the corridors. The child's nightmares grew worse, waking in tears, whispering about voices in the garden, and the way Dalton looked at her when no one else was watching. Grace began writing everything down. She kept a small notebook hidden in her apron pocket, where she recorded dates, overheard words, names of visitors, and every strange detail Arabella told her. It was risky, but she knew she would need proof if she ever hoped to protect the girl. She also began forming quiet alliances with some of the staff. The cook who had worked for the family for years. The gardener who always averted his eyes but knew every corner of the estate. Bit by bit, they whispered pieces of the puzzle to her. The driver Manuel had been kind, often sneaking treats to Arabella. Then one night, he simply vanished. The next morning, Dalton had new instructions for everyone's silence about Manuel, and loyalty to the Whitmores above all. Grace's suspicion hardened into certainty. Manuel hadn't left. Something had happened to him that night in the garden, something Arabella had seen, and Dalton had covered it up with blood and threats. The Whitmores, either blinded by their trust in Dalton or complicit in his secrets, carried on with their glamorous lives, never suspecting the terror consuming their daughter. Grace wrestled with fury every time she saw Mrs. Whitmore smile for the cameras, her diamond necklaces glittering, while Arabella hid behind Grace's skirts like a shadow. The breaking point came one late evening when Grace entered the nursery to find Arabella trembling by the window. The child's pajamas were again smeared with something dark. Grace rushed to her, fear clawing her chest. "What happened?" she whispered. Arabella's tears fell fast. "He came in," she choked. "He said if I ever tell, he'll make you disappear like Manuel." Grace's vision blurred with rage. Dalton had entered the child's room again. He was escalating. This wasn't just about silencing Arabella. It was about controlling her with fear, until she broke completely. Grace wiped away the bloodstains, this time from a small scratch on Arabella's hand, where Dalton had pressed his ring hard enough to break the skin. She bandaged it carefully, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the fire rising inside her. Enough was enough. She could no longer wait, no longer tiptoe around danger. She had to act, even if it meant risking her life. That night, when the mansion finally grew silent, Grace slipped into the library where she had once overheard the men. She searched the desk drawers by candlelight, her breath shallow. In one locked drawer she found a file filled with documents, financial ledgers, property deeds, and hidden among them an envelope. Inside were photographs. Her heart stopped as she looked at them, blurry images of a man in the garden, Manuel. The last photo showed him lying on the ground, unmoving. Dalton's hand, identifiable by the thick silver ring, was gripping the man's shoulder. Grace's body shook as she slid the photos back into the envelope. It was true. Everything Arabella said was true. Dalton had killed Manuel, and he had threatened the girl to ensure her silence. Grace took the envelope and slipped it under her apron, her mind already racing with plans. She knew she couldn't confront Dalton directly. He would destroy her before she got the chance. And she couldn't go to Mrs. Whitmore, who worshipped appearances too much to believe such a story. No, she needed a place where Dalton's influence couldn't reach. A reporter, perhaps, or the police precinct in the city, where voices of ordinary people still carried weight. But she also knew time was running out. Dalton was growing bolder. Soon, he might do more than scratch Arabella's hand. The next morning, Grace disguised her fear beneath a calm smile as she dressed Arabella for school. "We're going on a little trip today, baby," she whispered. Arabella's eyes widened. "Will he follow us?" Grace kissed her forehead. "Not if we move quickly." She packed the small bag she had hidden weeks ago, tucking the envelope of photographs inside, and slipped out through the servants' entrance. Her heart pounded as she hurried Arabella down the path toward the bus stop, her eyes scanning every corner for Dalton's figure. But fate wasn't so kind. As they neared the gate, a sleek black car pulled up, and Dalton stepped out, his smile cold as ice. "Going somewhere, Grace?" he asked, his voice silky but deadly. Grace's hand tightened around Arabella's. "To the park," she lied, forcing her tone to remain steady. Dalton's eyes flicked to the bag slung over Grace's shoulder. "That seems like an awfully heavy bag for a stroll." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating, his hand reaching toward the child. Arabella whimpered and hid behind Grace. For the first time, Grace didn't retreat. She stood tall, her voice strong. "Stay away from her." Dalton's smile faltered, surprise flashing in his eyes at her defiance. "You forget your place," he hissed. Grace met his gaze without flinching. "My place is by her side. And if you come near her again, the world will know what you've done." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then Dalton's face twisted with rage. He leaned close, his whisper venomous. "If you speak, you'll regret it." But Grace, clutching Arabella's hand, whispered back with steel in her voice, "No more than Manuel regretted trusting you." Dalton's eyes widened. She knew. Without another word, he turned back to his car, his fury barely concealed. Grace wasted no time. She hurried Arabella onto the nearest bus, holding her close as the city rushed by outside. The child buried her face in Grace's chest, whispering, "I'm scared." Grace kissed her hair, whispering fiercely, "So am I, baby. But we're stronger than fear, and we're not alone." As the bus carried them farther from the mansion, Grace looked out the window at the skyline and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The battle wasn't over, but she had the truth in her hands and the determination of a mother's heart, even if she wasn't Arabella's by blood. And she knew, deep in her soul, that love was stronger than power, stronger than lies, stronger even than the darkness that haunted them. She would fight, no matter how high the walls or how dangerous the enemies. Because this wasn't just about protecting an heiress. It was about proving that even the smallest voices, the voice of a child, the courage of a nanny, could shatter the silence of corruption and bring truth into the light. The bus rattled through the city, carrying them away from the manicured gardens and chandeliers of the Whitmore estate and into streets alive with ordinary life. Children chasing bulls, vendors shouting over produce stands, the smells of fried food and exhaust mingling in the air. Grace felt the weight of every second. Dalton wouldn't let them go so easily. His power wasn't limited to the mansion. It stretched like invisible chains into the city, the courts, even the newspapers. But Grace had something he hadn't expected: evidence. And more than that, she had conviction that burned hotter than fear. She brought Arabella first to a safe place, a small church on the corner of an aging street, where Father Thomas, a man with kind eyes and weathered hands, welcomed them without question. "You look like you've been running from wolves," he said quietly as Grace clutched Arabella's hand. Grace didn't deny it. She only asked for a room to rest, somewhere the little girl could feel safe. Father Thomas led them upstairs to a small chamber with a single bed and crucifix on the wall. "No wolves will touch her here," he promised, laying a hand gently on Arabella's head. When Arabella finally slept, her breathing steady and her fist unclenched from her rabbit, Grace went downstairs to the dimly lit office where Father Thomas poured her tea. Her hands shook as she pulled out the envelope and laid the photographs on the desk. His face hardened as he looked at them. "This is dangerous," he whispered. "You're up against men who think they are untouchable." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice did not falter. "Then we make them touchable. For her sake." The priest nodded slowly, then reached into his desk and pulled out a small phone book. "There's a journalist I trust. She's been chasing stories the powerful keep buried. If anyone can bring this into the light, it's her." He scribbled down a number and handed it to Grace. For the first time, Grace felt a spark of possibility, that maybe the truth could survive outside these walls. But even as hope flickered, danger closed in. That night, while the rain tapped gently at the church windows, Grace noticed a car parked across the street. Its engine idled too long, its lights flashing once before cutting off. Her blood ran cold. Dalton's men had already found them. She stayed awake all night, rocking in the chair beside Arabella's bed, praying under her breath. At dawn, she wrapped the girl in a shawl and prepared to move again. The journalist agreed to meet them in a cafe downtown, a small place crowded with morning customers. Grace held Arabella close as she slid into a booth opposite a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook. Her name was Alina, and she wasted no time. Grace laid the photos on the table, her voice trembling as she explained everything. Arabella's stained pajamas, Dalton's threats, Manuel's disappearance. Elena's pen scratched across paper furiously. When Grace finished, Elena leaned back, her jaw tight. This is explosive. If I print it, the Whitmores will come for me. For you, for the girl." Grace met her eyes. "Then you must. Because if we don't, they'll keep hurting people. They'll keep scaring her. She deserves freedom from this nightmare." Elena studied her, then nodded. "You're brave, Grace. Braver than most people I know." She promised to publish the story, to send copies of the evidence to allies so it couldn't be buried. Grace's heart lifted. But just as quickly, fear returned. Because she knew Dalton wouldn't sit still while his empire crumbled. Her fears proved true that very afternoon. As Grace and Arabella left the cafe, a black SUV pulled up beside the curb. The door swung open, and Dalton stepped out, his eyes blazing. The crowd of pedestrians blurred as Grace pulled Arabella behind her. "You're making a mistake," Dalton snarled. Grace stood firm, though her knees shook. "The mistake was yours when you thought a child's silence would last forever." His hand twitched toward her bag, the bag with the evidence. But before he could act, Elena appeared behind him, holding her phone high. "You so much as touch them, and this goes live to every outlet in the city," she shouted. Dalton froze, his jaw tight, fury radiating from him. The moment stretched like an eternity. Then he retreated, hissing through clenched teeth. "This isn't over." The SUV roared away, leaving the scent of exhaust and fear in its wake. Grace hugged Arabella tightly, whispering, "It is over. He just doesn't know it yet." Over the next week, Elena's story exploded across headlines. Billionaire family's advisor linked to disappearance of employee. Child witness threatened. The photographs splashed across news sites. The whispers of staff corroborated the story. And suddenly the world's gaze turned on the Whitmore mansion. The family tried to deny it at first, to dismiss Grace as an opportunist and Arabella as a confused child. But the tide of evidence was too strong. Under pressure, investigators were forced to act. Dalton was arrested, his empire of intimidation unraveling under scrutiny. The Whitmores themselves retreated from the public eye, their perfect image shattered. Through it all, Grace stayed by Arabella's side. The child, once trembling in fear, slowly began to smile again. She laughed for the first time in months when they visited the park together, chasing pigeons with her rabbit tucked under her arm. The shadows didn't vanish overnight. Arabella still woke sometimes from bad dreams, still clung to Grace when thunder shook the sky. But each day she grew lighter, freer, stronger. And Grace knew that the scars of fear could heal when wrapped in love. When asked later why she risked everything, Grace's answer was simple. Because love leaves no room for fear. That little girl is not my blood, but she is my child. And children deserve truth, not silence. Her words traveled farther than she imagined, inspiring others who lived in the shadow of the powerful to speak out, to protect the innocent, to believe that even the quietest voices could roar against injustice. And so, the story of a black nanny and a frightened little heiress became more than a scandal in the headlines. It became a testament that courage is not measured by wealth or status, but by the willingness to stand in the fire for someone else. Grace hadn't just saved Arabella. She had shown the world that truth, no matter how small it begins, can bring down giants.